The human forces launched a surprise counterattack against the Tsirith command center. With the help of a specialized unit of hackers, they infiltrated the Tsirith systems, disabling their orbital bombardment capabilities. The rebels had managed to outsmart the Tsirith, using their own technology against them. "Now's our chance," Captain Hayes shouted as she activated the detonators. Explosions erupted throughout the Tsirith's command center, sending shockwaves through their defenses. The elite Tsirith forces, momentarily disoriented, were forced to regroup. Daniel and Aya pressed forward, cutting down anyone who stood in their way. Their team moved in sync, a well-oiled machine, pushing closer to the heart of the Tsirith stronghold. But even with their victory, the final battle was far from over. The Tsirith's last line of defense was formidable, an elite squad of cyber-enhanced soldiers. These warriors were faster, stronger, and more ruthless than anything the rebels had ever encountered. In a clash of steel and blood, Daniel and his comrades fought the cyber soldiers with every ounce of strength they had left. Daniel faced off against the leader of the elite squad, a towering figure clad in dark armor. They exchanged blow after blow, each strike echoing across the battlefield. "I'll crush you, human," the cyber soldier sneered. "We'll never give up," Daniel growled, raising his weapon. "This is our world, and you don't belong here." With one final desperate strike, Daniel disarmed the cyber soldier, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the elite squad fell soon after, their armor shattered, their strength no match for the indomitable human spirit. The end of an era. As the last of the Tsirith forces crumbled, the rebel fighters stood victorious. The battlefield, once filled with chaos and death, was now quiet. The humans had won. The Tsirith Empire had fallen. Daniel looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. The battle was over. The Tsirith were no longer a threat. The war was won. But the cost had been great. So many had fallen in the fight. So many lives had been lost. Yet, despite the bitterness of the victory, there was a sense of hope that hung in the air. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said, turning to his team. "We've won today, but now we rebuild. We restore what was lost. We reclaim our future." Aya smiled at him, her eyes filled with both relief and determination. "Together, we can do anything." The rebels, the soldiers, the survivors, they all gathered together, looking toward the horizon. A new day had begun, a day of rebuilding, a day of hope. Humanity had stood against the most powerful force the galaxy had ever known, and they had won. Now, the true work began. The future was theirs to shape, and they would not make the same mistakes again. The human spirit had proven its strength, and it would lead them toward a new beginning. Daniel didn't answer. He was too focused on the girl. As she drank, her glowing lines brightened slightly, as if the water was bringing her back to life. But she was still weak. Too weak to run, too weak to fight. "We can't leave her here," Daniel said at last. Jenkins looked at him like he had gone insane. "What? She's an alien. Sarge, for all we know, she could be one of them." "She's not Tsirith," Daniel said firmly. "Doesn't mean she's friendly." Another soldier, Corporal Mendez, muttered. Daniel looked down at the girl again. Her hands were still shaking. She had curled in on herself, as if expecting them to attack her. He clenched his jaw. He had seen too many innocent people die in this war, too many left behind, because they weren't our problem. This girl was his problem now. "I'm taking her back to base," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Jenkins shook his head. "Sarge, we're already deep in enemy territory. You want to carry an injured alien back with us. What if she slows us down? What if Command?" "I don't care what Command says." His voice was cold, sharp, final. The squad fell silent. Daniel removed his armored gloves, his rough hands brushing against the girl's cold skin, as he carefully lifted her into his arms. She was light as a feather, too weak to resist. She made a soft, broken sound in her throat, a mixture of fear and exhaustion. But she didn't struggle. She had nowhere else to go. Daniel stood up, adjusting his grip on her fragile frame. "We're moving out. Now." Jenkins sighed. "If command court-martials you for this, I hope it was worth it." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't know why he was doing this. He only knew one thing. She had no one. Now she had him, and he would not let her die here. As he carried her through the ruined city, stepping over the dead, he made a silent promise. Whoever she was, whatever she had lost, she wasn't alone anymore. Not as long as he was alive. The journey back to base was long and dangerous. Sergeant Daniel Reeves carried the injured alien girl in his arms, moving carefully through the ruins of Valkyra 7. His squad followed behind, their rifles ready, scanning the shadows for any sign of the Xerath. The enemy was still out there, hunting, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The girl in his arms was light as a feather, too weak to move. Every now and then, she let out a soft, painful breath, her body trembling from exhaustion, blood loss, and fear. Daniel glanced down at her. Her lavender skin was covered in bruises, and her bioluminescent markings flickered weakly, as if fading. She looked so fragile, so close to death. But she was still alive. And as long as she was breathing, he wasn't going to let her die. The hard road back. "We need to pick up the pace," Jenkins muttered. "If the Xerath find us out here, we're dead." Daniel ignored him and kept walking. His arms burned from carrying the girl, but he refused to let go. The ruined city stretched for miles, filled with broken buildings, burned-out vehicles, and the remains of those who had not escaped the massacre. The Xerath never left survivors. The squad moved carefully, avoiding the open streets and sticking to the shadows. The last thing they needed was another fight. They were already low on ammo and exhausted from hours of combat. After an hour of careful movement, they finally saw it. Outpost Echo, a temporary Terran Defense Force base set up in the ruins. High metal walls, automated turrets, and bunkers made from salvaged wreckage surrounded the compound. Jenkins sighed in relief. "We made it." But Daniel wasn't relieved. He knew what was coming next. As they approached the gate, two heavily armed guards stepped forward. Their eyes immediately locked onto the alien girl in Daniel's arms. "The hell is that?" One of them barked, raising his rifle. Daniel didn't stop. "She's injured. She needs medical attention." The guards didn't lower their weapons. One of them, a bulky soldier named Graves, narrowed his eyes. "That thing's not human, Sergeant. Why the hell are you bringing it here?" "She's not a threat." Graves snorted. "Yeah, tell that to the brass. You really think Command is gonna let an alien waltz into our base? Especially after what those Xerath bastards did." Daniel's grip on the girl tightened. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. "She's not Xerath," he said. "She's different. She was dying out there, and I wasn't about to leave her behind." Graves shook his head. "Not your call, Sergeant. Step aside. We'll take it from here." Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. He didn't trust them. The girl stirred weakly, her fingers twitching as she tried to move. But the moment she saw the guns pointed at her, her body tensed with fear. Daniel felt her tremble against him. He made his choice. "I'm taking her to the medics," he said firmly. "If Command has a problem with it, they can talk to me directly." Graves' expression darkened. "Reeves, you don't get to make that call." Daniel locked eyes with him. "Yeah, watch me." Before Graves could react, Daniel pushed past him, moving toward the medical tent. His squad hesitated for a second, then followed. No one stopped them. Not yet. The girl who wouldn't speak. Inside the med tent, Dr. Lillian Carter, the unit's chief medic, was working on a wounded soldier when Daniel walked in. She looked up, startled. "What the hell?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the alien girl in his arms. Her eyes widened. "Doc," Daniel said, his voice urgent, "she needs help." Dr. Carter hesitated. She's not human. Daniel set the girl down on a stretcher, careful not to hurt her. She's bleeding, starving, and barely alive. Do your job. Carter hesitated for a long moment, then sighed. Damn it, Reeves. She grabbed her medical scanner and started running diagnostics. The other medics in the room exchanged nervous glances, but didn't interfere. The girl lay still, her golden eyes half open, watching everything with a mix of fear and confusion. She didn't speak. She hadn't said a single word since Daniel found her. As Carter worked, Daniel stayed by the stretcher. He could see the fear in the girl's eyes, the way she flinched at every touch, expecting pain. I told you, he said softly, kneeling beside her. You're safe. She didn't respond. But for the first time, she didn't try to pull away. Orders from above. Less than an hour later, the inevitable happened. Major Harland, the commanding officer of Outpost Echo, stormed into the med tent, his face a mask of fury. Sergeant Reeves, he barked. Daniel stood at attention. Sir. Harland's eyes snapped to the alien girl on the stretcher. His expression hardened. What the hell is that thing doing in my base? She's not a thing, Daniel said. She's a survivor. I don't give a damn what she is. She's not human. And you, Sergeant, have disobeyed direct orders by bringing an unknown alien into a classified military zone. Daniel's fists clenched. Sir, she was dying. I couldn't just leave her. Harland's face darkened. That wasn't your decision to make. He turned to the two guards standing behind him. Detain the alien. Place it under armed security until further notice. The girl tensed. Even though she didn't understand the words, she felt the danger. Daniel moved before he could think. He stepped between her and the guards, blocking their path. Harland's eyes narrowed. Sergeant, step aside. No. A dead silence filled the tent. The guards raised their weapons. Harland's voice was cold. You are disobeying the direct order. Daniel didn't care. He looked down at the girl. She was so small, so fragile, staring up at him with wide, fearful eyes. She had no one else. So he made his choice. You'll have to kill me first, he said. Harland's jaw clenched. You're making a mistake, Reeves. Daniel didn't move. The room was on the edge of chaos. The guards were tense, waiting for the order to fire. The medics stood frozen, not knowing what to do. And then, a soft sound broke the silence. The alien girl spoke. It was barely a whisper, a single word in a language no one understood. But the way she said it, soft, broken, almost pleading, made Daniel's heart stop. She was begging him not to leave her. And he wouldn't. Ever. Harland exhaled sharply, eyes burning with frustration. You want to throw your career away for a damn alien. Daniel's voice was calm, but unshakable. She's not just an alien. She's alive. For a long moment, Harland said nothing. Then, finally, he turned away. Fine, he muttered. But you're responsible for it now, Reeves. You deal with the consequences. With that, he stormed out of the tent. The guards lowered their weapons. Daniel let out a slow breath. He had made his choice. The girl was under his protection now, and no one, not the Xerath, not Command, not even his own people, was going to take her away. Because a soldier's oath wasn't just to his orders. It was to those who needed him most. And right now she needed him. More than anyone ever had, Sergeant Daniel Reeves had made his choice. He had stood against his commanding officer. He had refused to hand over the alien girl he had saved from death. And now he was paying the price. The outpost had turned against him. At first, things seemed quiet. The soldiers around him acted normal, but there was a tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. Daniel could feel the stares as he walked through the camp. He heard the whispers behind his back, but he didn't care. The girl, whom he had started calling Aya, was alive because of him. That was all that mattered. She was recovering in the medical tent, still weak but stronger than before. She no longer flinched every time someone got close. She still didn't speak much, but her golden eyes watched everything, studying the world around her with a mix of curiosity and fear. Daniel had made a silent promise. He would protect her, no matter what. He just didn't know how soon he'd have to prove it. The betrayal. The attack came at midnight. Daniel was in the med tent, keeping watch over Aya, when the first gunshot rang out. Then another. Then a scream. Daniel snapped awake just as the alarm blared through the outpost. Soldiers were shouting outside. He grabbed his rifle, heart pounding. Then the tent flaps ripped open. Jenkins, his squad mate, burst inside. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Daniel, we gotta move. Now." "What's going on?" Daniel demanded. Command gave the order, Jenkins panted. "They want the alien dead, and if you get in the way, they'll kill you too." Daniel's blood ran cold. He barely had time to process the words before gunfire erupted outside the tent. Escape into the night. Daniel didn't hesitate. He turned to Aya, who was sitting up now, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "Come on," he said, reaching for her hand. "We have to go." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the urgency in his voice. She grabbed his hand. Daniel turned to Jenkins. "Are you with me?" Jenkins hesitated. I don't know, man. They're calling you a traitor. They'll court-martial you if you run." Daniel locked eyes with him. "If I stay, they'll kill her." Jenkins swallowed hard. Then, finally, he nodded. "I'll cover you." That was all Daniel needed to hear. The three of them rushed out of the tent, staying low as bullets flew through the air. The outpost was in chaos. Soldiers were firing in every direction, their shadows flickering in the firelight. Someone had sabotaged the power generators, and half the base was covered in darkness. Daniel pulled Aya close, shielding her with his body as they moved. They had one goal, the eastern gate. If they could get past the perimeter wall, they could escape into the ruins. They just had to survive long enough to get there. The hunt begins. They made it halfway across the base before the first shout rang out. "There he is, Sergeant Reeves. Stop him." Spotlights flashed in their direction. A second later, bullets tore through the air. Daniel pushed Aya behind cover, firing back as Jenkins laid down suppressing fire. "We're not gonna make it," Jenkins shouted. "We don't have a choice," Daniel yelled. He turned to Aya, who was shaking with fear, but still holding onto his arm. "Aya, listen to me. We have to run. I need you to trust me." She hesitated for only a second. Then she nodded. That was all Daniel needed. He grabbed her hand and ran, fleeing into the ruins. They reached the eastern gate just as an explosion rocked the outpost. The blast threw Daniel and Aya to the ground. Jenkins wasn't so lucky. Daniel turned just in time to see him hit by a burst of gunfire, his body jerking before he collapsed to the dirt. "Jenkins," Daniel shouted. Jenkins looked up at him, coughing up blood. "Go, just go." Daniel hesitated for a split second, then grabbed Aya and ran. He didn't have time to grieve. If he stayed, they'd both be dead. They slipped through a break in the perimeter wall, disappearing into the ruins of Valkyra 7. Behind them, the outpost burned. The Terran Defense Force had just declared war on one of their own, hunted by his own kind. Daniel and Aya didn't stop running for miles. By the time they finally collapsed from exhaustion, the outpost was far behind them. They were deep in the ruins now, surrounded by crumbling skyscrapers and the wreckage of old battles. Daniel's body ached, but he forced himself to stay alert. He knew they weren't safe yet. The Terran soldiers would come looking for him. His own people, his own brothers in arms. They would hunt him down like a traitor. And when they found him, they would kill him on sight. But he didn't regret his choice. Aya sat beside him, shivering from cold and fear. He wrapped his jacket around her, offering what little warmth he could. She looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with a question. Daniel didn't know what she was asking, but he knew what he had to do. "We keep moving," he said softly. "We find a way to survive." Aya didn't speak, but slowly she reached out and took his hand. She understood. They were alone now, hunted, outnumbered, but together, and Daniel wasn't going to let anyone take her away. Not the Terran military, not the Xerath, not anyone, because she was under his protection. And no force in the universe was going to change that. The landscape stretched out before Sergeant Daniel Reeves like a desolate wilderness, a place where only the most relentless survivors could thrive. The ruins of Valkyra 7 had once been a thriving metropolis, a beacon of human ingenuity and advancement. But now it was little more than a graveyard of fallen cities, fallen hopes, and fallen lives. The earth was cracked. The skies were a dull, almost sickly orange, and the air tasted of ash and regret. Aya, the alien girl Daniel had sworn to protect, huddled next to him as they trudged through the wreckage. Her golden eyes scanned their surroundings, always alert. Her bioluminescent skin had healed over the past few days, but she was still fragile, her movements slow and cautious. The terror she had once shown in the outpost was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by something stronger: trust. But trust alone wouldn't be enough. Daniel had known from the moment he'd defied his command that he'd become a wanted man. He'd traded his career, his rank, and his reputation for the life of an alien girl he barely understood. The question now was, would he survive the consequences? The Terran Defense Force had declared him a traitor. Every soldier under his command had turned their backs on him, hunting him like a criminal, a fugitive. His own brothers in arms had become the enemy. And as if that weren't enough, the Xerath, the ruthless alien invaders who had sparked the war, were still hunting for the remnants of humanity. Daniel and Aya were not just fighting for survival against human soldiers. They were now caught between the crushing forces of two empires, each more powerful and unforgiving than the last. The human spirit, Daniel thought, had always been about survival against impossible odds. But that spirit was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. A place of refuge. They had to keep moving. But where to? The world outside the walls of the outpost was a dangerous wasteland, full of hostile terrain, and worse still, the Xerath. These towering insect-like beings were relentless, their hunger for conquest never satisfied. Daniel had seen what they could do, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to wipe out the last remnants of humanity if they found them. But after days of running, the exhaustion weighed heavily on both him and Aya. They needed to rest. They needed shelter, a place to regroup. After a day of travel, they stumbled upon something unexpected: a hidden bunker buried deep within the ruins of an old military research facility. At first, Daniel was suspicious. This could easily be a trap, another test of loyalty from his former comrades. But as they cautiously approached the entrance, he noticed the markings on the walls. These weren't Terran military symbols. They were old civilian insignia, faded but still legible. The markings seemed to be leading them down. "Is this a trap?" Aya asked softly, her voice still heavy with the remnants of her fear. Daniel paused. He could feel his heart racing. The world outside was a maze of danger. But for once, this felt different, almost like a chance at survival. "I don't know, but we don't have many options left." He stepped forward, his rifle raised, scanning the dark corridor. The human spirit awakens. Inside the bunker, the air was stale, but there was a faint warmth, a sense of security that felt unnatural in the chaos. Daniel found a room at the center of the facility, a command center, abandoned long ago, but still surprisingly intact. It looked like the place had been evacuated in a hurry. There were files, maps, and old communications equipment scattered around, half destroyed but still usable. But more importantly, there were signs of life. Old bloodstains and scratch marks on the walls hinted that this place had once been a refuge for someone, a fellow soldier or a group of survivors who had sought shelter here, only to be driven out by the same forces that now hunted Daniel and Aya. "We're not the first to be here," Daniel muttered. Aya nodded, her golden eyes flickering with understanding. Daniel began to sift through the records, trying to make sense of the scattered documents. Most of it was military jargon, coordinates, mission reports, and encrypted messages. But one thing caught his eye: a map of the area, one that showed hidden routes and outposts. And it wasn't just any map. It seemed to be a map of Sirith-controlled zones and human resistance pockets. Daniel's pulse quickened. This was it. This could be their way out. The Sirith had wiped out most of the human colonies, but they hadn't gotten them all. There were still pockets of resistance scattered across the galaxy. If they could find one of them, they could fight back. "It's a long shot," Daniel said, "but it's our best chance." Aya stepped closer, her delicate hand resting on his arm. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. She was ready to fight. For the first time since they'd fled the outpost, Daniel felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to fuel him. He was fighting for something bigger than his own survival. He was fighting for humanity's freedom. And, as he had learned from the past days, humanity had a spirit that no galactic empire could crush. The tyranny of the Sirith. The next few days were a blur of movement, strategy, and careful planning. Daniel and Aya followed the routes marked on the map, avoiding Terran patrols and Sirith forces at all costs. The further they traveled, the more Daniel could feel the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He wasn't just a fugitive now. He was a symbol of rebellion, a symbol of what humanity could accomplish when it refused to bend to the will of an all-powerful force. But even as they ventured deeper into enemy territory, Daniel knew that the Sirith were not to be underestimated. Their technology was superior, their numbers vast, and their hunger for control insatiable. If they caught wind of Daniel's defection, they would stop at nothing to destroy him. One evening, as they made camp, Daniel heard something, movement in the shadows. His hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but before he could react, a voice called out from the darkness. "You're not alone, Sergeant." Daniel froze. The voice was familiar, though he hadn't heard it in days. He turned toward the sound, expecting to see one of his old comrades, a fellow soldier who had once been part of his unit. Instead, standing before him in the moonlight, was a group of human rebels. "They sent us," the leader of the group said, stepping forward. "We're the ones who haven't forgotten what it means to fight for freedom. The human spirit is still alive." Daniel's heart raced. Could this really be happening? Was there hope left after all? He lowered his rifle and stepped forward, a grin tugging at the corner of his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive again. Aya stood beside him, her hand resting in his, a silent promise that they were not alone. Together, with the help of this underground movement, they would take the fight to the Sirith. They would resist. Humanity's last stand. In the heart of the galaxy's darkest war, the human spirit was about to ignite once again. The forces of galactic tyranny, represented by the ruthless Sirith, had underestimated the strength of humanity. The will to survive had always been humanity's greatest weapon. And now, it was about to be unleashed. Daniel Reeves and Aya were no longer just refugees. They were the spark that would ignite the fire of rebellion. And the galaxy would tremble as the humans fought for their freedom, their lives, and their future. This was just the beginning. The fight had only just begun. And in the end, humanity would rise above the ashes, stronger than ever before. The sky above was a dark, starless void, but Daniel Reeves could feel the surge of hope that filled him as he walked with Aya through the ruins of the old city. The rebel group that had found them was small but fierce, a collection of survivors who refused to bow to the will of the Sirith. They were the last remnants of humanity's fighting spirit, a spirit that, despite everything, refused to be extinguished. The Sirith, for all their strength and technological superiority, had failed to break the will of humanity. They had underestimated them at every turn, thinking that the humans would simply fall in line. bow to their new overlords. But now, they had made a grave mistake. They had awakened a force that the Tsareth could not control, the wrath of humanity. Daniel had learned, over the past few days, that this small rebel faction was far from helpless. They were an underground network, their movements swift and stealthy, always one step ahead of the enemy. The rebels had been planning, quietly amassing weapons, and they had a plan, a big one. They had intelligence that could change the tide of the war, that could turn the tables on the Tsareth, and give humanity a fighting chance. "This is our moment," said the leader of the rebels, Captain Lara Hayes, as she surveyed a large table covered with maps and schematics. "The Tsareth are complacent. They think we're finished, that the war is over. But they're wrong. The human spirit has been pushed too far. Now we fight back." Daniel stood beside her, looking over the plan. His eyes narrowed as he processed the coordinates and strategy laid out before him. This wasn't just a small raid. It was a full-scale offensive, one that could break the Tsareth's grip on the region. This could actually work," Daniel said, his voice filled with a new sense of determination. "We could hit them where it hurts." Hayes nodded. "Exactly. We have the element of surprise. They won't know what hit them." Aya, who had been quietly observing, spoke up in her soft, melodic voice. "We can do this." Daniel turned to her, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. Despite everything she had been through, despite the trauma, the fear, and the unfamiliar world she found herself in, Aya was unafraid. She had found strength in the face of unimaginable terror. She had found her place among the humans who had saved her. "We'll do it together," Daniel said, taking her hand. "We fight, and we win." The calm before the storm. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Daniel and the rebels moved quickly, gathering resources, recruiting more fighters, and setting up hidden bases in the city's old structures. Weapons were smuggled in, communications were set up, and all the while, the threat of the Tsareth loomed just beyond the horizon. The deeper they ventured into the ruins, the more Daniel realized that the world they were fighting for wasn't just the physical land. It was the human spirit that had been left in the wake of the Tsareth's destruction. In the faces of those he encountered, the men and women, young and old, he saw something new. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were rebels, fighters, determined to reclaim everything that had been lost. Despite the hardship, despite the weight of their struggle, they had found hope again. And that hope, Daniel knew, was the Tsareth's greatest weakness. Night after night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their temporary shelter. He thought about his old comrades, the soldiers who had betrayed him, who had turned their backs on him for protecting Aya. He thought about the lives they'd lost, the friends who had died in the chaos of war. And most of all, he thought about the choice he'd made. The choice to protect Aya, to defy the military, to become an enemy of his own people. But that choice had led him to this moment, to this army of rebels, to the spark of rebellion that was spreading across the galaxy like wildfire. "We are humanity's wrath," Daniel whispered to himself in the stillness of the night. The words felt like a mantra, a declaration of intent. In the morning, they would strike. The offensive begins. At dawn, the first wave of the offensive began. The rebel forces moved under the cover of darkness, launching guerrilla attacks on Tsareth supply lines and communication centers. Daniel and Captain Hayes led a small squad through the city's forgotten streets, taking out the Tsareth patrols and clearing the path for the main assault. The Tsareth, caught off guard, scrambled to react, but the humans were swift, precise, and relentless. They had been pushed to the brink, and now they were fighting back with a fury the Tsareth had never encountered. Daniel, rifle in hand, led the charge, his heart pounding with adrenaline. For the first time since the war began, he felt like he was part of something larger than himself. "There's no turning back now," Hayes said as they crouched behind cover, watching the chaos unfold. "This is it. The first Cirith base fell within hours, their communications disrupted, their forces scattered. The humans were on the move, spearheaded by the wrath of those they had wronged. Daniel's squad moved swiftly through the chaos, taking out one target after another. They struck with precision, and before long, the Cirith realized they were being overrun. "This is just the beginning," Daniel muttered under his breath. "We're going to make them pay." The Cirith's counterattack. As the humans gained momentum, the Cirith launched their counteroffensive. They were no longer underestimating their opponents. They mobilized their most advanced forces and sent out dreadnoughts, massive warships capable of decimating entire cities in a single strike. The battle turned into a bloodbath, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Cirith's relentless bombardment from the sky forced the rebels to fall back. But despite the overwhelming odds, humanity's resolve never wavered. Daniel and his comrades dug in, determined to fight to the last man, knowing that every moment, every bullet, was bringing them closer to victory. Daniel fought beside his squad, moving through the wreckage of the city, taking down Cirith soldiers with brutal efficiency. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of gunfire. Explosions rocked the ground beneath their feet, and the ground trembled with the weight of war. But through it all, Daniel could feel the fire inside him burn brighter than ever. Humanity would not bow. He was interrupted by a sudden explosion that rocked the building they were hiding in. A few soldiers were knocked off their feet. Daniel hit the ground, his ears ringing, his heart racing. "Stay focused," he yelled. Aya was beside him in an instant, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "We can do this, Daniel. Together." The ground shook again as a massive Cirith warship descended from the sky. It hovered above the battlefield, its weapons charged and ready to fire. But the humans had one weapon the Cirith didn't, the element of surprise. Daniel glanced at Captain Hayes. "It's time." With a single nod, Hayes activated the signal. A series of explosions ripped through the warship's hull, sending it plummeting to the ground in a fiery crash. The humans had planted explosives in key locations, sabotaging the Cirith's most powerful weapon. As the ship burned, the rebels raised their weapons, the victory ringing in their ears. This was humanity's wrath unleashed, fueled by the will to survive, the drive to protect, and the desire to reclaim their future. Victory's price. By the time the smoke cleared, the battle was won. But it had come at a cost. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of both the fallen Cirith and the brave humans who had given their lives for this victory. Daniel stood over the wreckage of the Cirith warship, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The mission was complete, but it was far from over. The war wasn't won yet. The battle they had just fought was only the first of many. "This isn't the end," Captain Hayes said, her voice tired but resolute. "We've taken the first step, but the Cirith will come for us again. And next time, we hit them harder." Daniel looked around at the faces of the survivors, the fighters who had refused to give up. "We'll be ready," he said, his voice filled with the power of their shared resolve. The war for humanity's future was just beginning, and Daniel knew one thing for certain. They would fight until the very end, because humanity's wrath was unstoppable. The world had been battered. The cities, once teeming with life, were now ruins, with only scattered survivors remaining to tell the stories of what happened. But Daniel Reeves, Aya, and the rest of the rebel forces could feel it in the air. The war was coming to an end, one way or another. The Cirith, the empire that had spread its claws across the galaxy, had underestimated the heart of humanity. And now, they were going to learn the price of that mistake. The rebellion had grown stronger after their victory against the Cirith warship, but the Cirith didn't take defeat lightly. They had launched a full-scale offensive against the human resistance, deploying their most powerful forces, including elite shock troops and massive orbital bombardment units. Daniel stood in the command room, gazing at the holographic map that displayed the Cirith's movements. His eyes were tired, but there was a fire burning in his chest that hadn't been extinguished. They could feel the weight of the final battle coming. Soon, they would either break the Xerath's empire or become another footnote in history. We've taken out their command center, but we still have the bulk of their forces to deal with, Captain Lara Hayes said as she paced around the table. Her tone was calm, but her eyes betrayed the pressure she was under. They know we're coming. We won't get another chance like this. This is the final stand. Aya, standing by Daniel's side, placed a hand on his shoulder. We've come so far, Daniel. We can't stop now. He turned to her, a soft smile breaking through his hardened exterior. No, we won't stop. We finish this. For everyone we've lost. For the future. The room fell into a brief silence as everyone absorbed his words. Then, Captain Hayes broke the stillness. It's time. We attack at dawn. The final battle begins. The night before the battle, the rebels gathered in the old city ruins for one last time. The soldiers knew the risks, but they also knew that this was their chance to change everything. There was no turning back. Victory was the only option, but they were prepared to pay the ultimate price. We'll face the Xerath elite forces head-on, Daniel said as he stood before the rebels. But remember, we fight for something bigger than ourselves. We fight for every soul they've enslaved, for every human they've murdered, and for those who can't fight anymore. We'll fight with everything we have. The cheers that erupted from the crowd were filled with raw emotion, hope, defiance, and the promise of a new beginning. The air was electric with the tension of the coming fight, and the rebels, knowing the stakes, were more determined than ever to see this through. As the first rays of dawn began to break through the ruined city's skyline, Daniel, Aya, and the rest of the rebel forces began their march to the front lines. They would face the Xerath's last stronghold, a heavily fortified city, where the main fleet of the Empire was stationed. If they were to win this war, this was where it had to end. The human forces had a secret weapon, the human spirit, a force that Xerath could never fully comprehend. And that spirit was about to be unleashed in a way the invaders would never forget. Clash of Titans. The battlefield stretched out before them like an ocean of destruction. The Xerath had already set up defensive lines, their weapons primed, and their forces ready. But the humans had the element of surprise on their side. The first wave of the rebel forces moved in, weapons raised, voices unified in battle cries. The Xerath responded with devastating firepower. Their dreadnoughts fired orbital lasers from the sky, cutting swaths through the rebel ranks. The ground rumbled with the force of explosions, sending debris into the air. The Xerath shock troops, massive and armored, charged forward with brutal efficiency, ready to crush the human resistance. But the humans didn't retreat. They fought back with everything they had. Daniel led the charge, his pulse racing as the adrenaline surged through his body. Each step was like a battle against gravity itself, but the image of Aya, standing behind him, kept him going. Push forward, Daniel shouted, rallying the soldiers around him. We fight for a future, for freedom. The sounds of battle filled the air. Gunfire, explosions, and the roar of war echoed across the battlefield. Soldiers on both sides fell, but the humans pushed on, determined to hold their ground. Aya, ever the symbol of hope, fought with a fierce energy that seemed to defy logic. Her hands moved with lightning speed, striking down enemy soldiers with swift precision. Daniel noticed the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had ignited within him the moment he decided to protect her. She was no longer just a victim of the war. She was a force in her own right, a symbol of the power humanity could unleash when cornered. The tide turns. As the battle raged on, Daniel realized that the Xerath forces were not as invincible as they appeared. Their overconfidence, their reliance on their advanced technology, was their greatest weakness. They had underestimated the determination and creativity of humanity.